Hi, and welcome to this lecture on the history of quality management. Now we'll start with a very brief introduction to the history of it. And in order to make a certain amount of sense of it, we have to know something about total quality management. So we'll review total quality management briefly, and then have a look at some of the people who contributed to total quality management. So we'll get started. Now, the history of quality management can be traced back to Adam Smith in the book The Wealth of Nations. Now, in that book, he talks about the advantages of specialization. Now, presumably at that time, most manufacturing was done in a very artisan-like way. That is, each person would make the complete article. Now, the whole idea of specialization is that you can have specialization of equipment and specialization of manufacturing. Now, he picked on the example of making pins, which I gather was a pretty big deal at that time, and advocated that the separate parts of the pin be split up. So you had one making the head of the pin and the other one making the body of the pin, and somebody else putting them together. Now, using that approach, various companies did report productivity gains in the order of about 1,000, this kind of thing, which was pretty radical at the time. Now, that was followed by, the most famous one was Frederick Winslow Taylor, who started most of his work in the 1880s. Fred Taylor was rather of the view that there are all these different ways of doing things, and in that way of doing things, there had to be a best way of doing things. So the whole idea was to find the best way and have everybody follow the best way of doing something. That was also tied up with his idea that people could be persuaded to work as directed, essentially. You could have somebody looking at how the task was done and try to persuade them to do it the best particular way. Now, he did that quite famously. I think it was unloading pig iron from railway carriages was the task that he took on. It happened that at the time, this was tied up with quite a lot of political turmoil and conflict between management and workers. Now, in this course, I won't particularly deal with that conflict. It was there, and it has been there ever since, and has attended all the work of process improvement and productivity management ever since that time. So far as this course is concerned, we'll just have to put that aside and accept the argument that improvements in productivity are also feedback to the workers or people doing the work by enabling them to do more work and to earn more money. Now, aside from Fred Taylor, he was pretty famous at the time, but it was picked up then by the time and motion study movement that not only tried to determine whether there was a best way, but could they improve it by taking, for example, slow motion films, by tracing the physical movements of people, by investigating where the time was spent. This time and motion movement was a pretty big deal from, say, the early 1920s right up until about the 1940s, and even through to during the Second World War. It was followed by total quality management, which we'll review in a minute. But the essential elements of Taylor's best way of doing things, this so-called scientific management method and the time and motion study method, was the assumption that you could somehow specify precisely how the task was to be done. And if you did that, then any errors, any loss of productivity, any loss of quality, any loss of output must necessarily be due to the person doing the job. Either they didn't understand how to do it, or they just were slacking off, or there was some other problem. Obviously, if you specified it brilliantly, then there could be no excuse for not getting it perfectly right. Now, that's an exaggeration, but it was and still is in many ways largely the assumption that attends to this whole idea of specifying the process. If I've specified it well, then you must necessarily get the results, and anything other than the expected result quite frequently blamed on the person doing the work. Total quality management took a different view, so as I say, we'll explore that in a moment.